Welcome back to Quiet History by Sen. Tonight, we are leaving behind the battlefields, political crises, and great wars of the 20th century. Instead, we are traveling much farther into the past. Imagine that it is an ordinary morning in Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. The sun has not yet fully risen. The narrow streets are still partly covered in shadow. Somewhere nearby, a baker is preparing bread for the morning. A wooden shutter opens above the street. Footsteps echo between tall apartment buildings. A merchant begins arranging his goods. Water flows gently from a public fountain, and in the distance, the enormous city is slowly waking. This is not the Rome of emperors and generals. Tonight, we are interested in something much simpler. What was it actually like to live here? Where did ordinary Romans sleep? What did they eat? Where did they work? How did they get water? What did they do for entertainment? And when another busy day finally came to an end, what was it like to fall asleep in one of the largest cities of the ancient world? So, settle into a comfortable position. Let the modern world become quiet around you, and let us spend one ordinary day in ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was a city that began its day early. Without electric lights, people's routines naturally followed the sun more closely than ours do today. As the first light appeared over the rooftops, many Romans were already awake. For wealthy families, the morning might begin inside a spacious private house known as a domus. These homes could contain courtyards, decorated rooms, fountains, mosaics, and gardens. But this was not how most people in Rome lived. For many ordinary inhabitants, home was an apartment building known as an insula. These buildings could rise several stories above the crowded streets. The better apartments were generally closer to the ground. They were easier to reach, more spacious, and sometimes had better access to water. Higher apartments were usually cheaper. They could also be smaller, hotter in summer, colder in winter, and more difficult to escape if something went wrong. Fire was a constant concern. So was structural collapse. Rome was crowded, and space was valuable. For a family living several floors above the street, the morning might begin in a small room with relatively little furniture. Perhaps there was a bed, a chest containing clothing, a small lamp, a few cooking utensils. Possessions depended greatly upon wealth. Then came the sounds from below, voices, animals, merchants, workers, carts. The city was waking, and soon the family would descend the stairs and join it. Breakfast for many Romans was simple. There was no large table filled with the foods we might associate with a modern breakfast. A little bread could be enough. Perhaps olives, cheese, fruit, depending upon season and income. The wealthy could enjoy greater variety, but for ordinary people, the first meal of the day was often light. Bread was enormously important. Across Rome, bakeries produced loaves in large quantities. Grain arrived from different parts of the Roman world, helping feed the enormous urban population. Some poorer Roman citizens were eligible for distributions of grain. For others, buying food was simply part of the daily routine, and shopping had to be frequent. There were no refrigerators humming quietly in Roman apartments. Food could spoil, so markets, street vendors, bakeries, and small shops played an important role in everyday life. A person stepping onto the street in the morning might pass baskets of vegetables, fresh bread, olives, fish, wine, fruit, cheese, and countless other goods arriving from across Italy and the Mediterranean. Rome was the center of an empire, and in its markets, that empire could sometimes be tasted. Now imagine stepping into the street. The Rome around you would probably feel both familiar and completely foreign. There are shops, people going to work, children, customers arguing over prices, neighbors speaking from doorways, but the streets themselves are narrow. Buildings rise high on either side. There are no engines, no traffic lights, no modern advertisements glowing from walls. Instead, movement comes from human beings and animals. Porters carry heavy loads. Merchants move goods. Slaves perform errands for their owners. Visitors search for directions. Officials and wealthy citizens may move through the crowds accompanied by attendants. The streets could be noisy. They could also be dirty. Waste disposal was nothing like the system of a modern city. Yet Rome also possessed infrastructure that would have impressed many visitors from the ancient world. Water flowed into the city through aqueducts. Public fountains provided water to residents who did not have a private supply. There were public toilets, drains, bath complexes, roads, bridges. For all its discomforts, Rome was also an extraordinary piece of urban engineering. One of the wonders of Roman life was something we now take almost completely for granted: water. Rome's population required enormous quantities of it. Drinking water was needed. Baths needed water. Fountains needed water. Businesses needed water. and the Romans developed an extensive network of aqueducts to bring it into the city from distant sources. Much of an aqueduct did not actually travel across the enormous stone arches we often associate with Roman engineering. Large portions ran underground or followed carefully calculated gradients across the landscape. Gravity did most of the work. When the water reached Rome, it could be distributed to fountains, baths, public facilities, and some private homes. For many ordinary residents of apartment buildings, however, there was no convenient tap inside the home. Water might have to be collected from a public fountain and carried upstairs. Imagine living on an upper floor. Every container of water used for drinking, washing, or cooking might have to travel those same stairs. Suddenly, something as simple as a glass of water becomes a little more valuable. For many Romans, morning was the time for work. The city contained an enormous variety of occupations. Bakers prepared bread, metal workers shaped tools, carpenters worked with timber, shopkeepers served customers, porters carried goods, fullers cleaned clothing, teachers instructed children, scribes copied documents, merchants negotiated prices, laborers moved cargo, slaves worked in almost every part of Roman society. Some served inside wealthy households. Others worked in workshops, business, agriculture, administration, mines, or construction. The experience of slavery varied enormously, but slavery itself was deeply embedded in the Roman economy and social system. For wealthy Roman men, the morning could also involve business and social obligations. One important custom was the relationship between patrons and clients. A wealthy or influential man might receive visitors at his home in the morning. These clients could seek assistance, favors, introductions, or financial help. In return, they offered loyalty and public support. Politics, friendship, business, and social status often blended together. Rome was not merely a city where people worked. It was a city where relationships mattered. Who you knew could be almost as important as what you did. While adults went about their work, Roman children experienced very different lives depending upon the families into which they were born. Children from wealthy households might receive education from private tutors. Others attended small schools. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic. Older boys from prosperous families might study grammar, literature, and rhetoric. The ability to speak persuasively was particularly valuable for someone hoping for a future in law or politics. But education was not universal. Children from poor families might receive only limited schooling. Some began working while still young. Girls could receive education as well, particularly in wealthier households, although Roman society offered men and women very different public roles. When lessons ended, children were still children. They played games. They had toys. Dolls have survived from the Roman world. So have gaming pieces and other small objects that remind us that ancient childhood was not entirely different from childhood today. A Roman child might have lived 2,000 years ago, but that child could still become bored during a lesson, still want to play, still laugh with friends, and still look forward to the end of the school day. As morning moved toward midday, the commercial areas of Rome remained busy. The Forum was one of the most important public spaces in the city, but Rome contained many marketplaces and shopping areas. Goods arrived from across an enormous empire. Olive oil might come from Spain or North Africa. Wine traveled from different regions. Grain arrived in huge quantities, particularly from Egypt and North Africa. Spices and luxury goods could travel much farther. The wealthy could purchase foods and objects that ordinary Romans might rarely experience. But everyday markets also sold the necessities of urban life: bread, vegetables, lamps, pottery, clothing, tools, fish, meat, wine. The streets surrounding busy commercial areas must have produced a remarkable mixture of smells: fresh bread from an oven, fish, olive oil, smoke, animals, perfume, wine, and, inevitably, waste. Ancient Rome was magnificent, but it was not always pleasant smelling. Romans did not necessarily organize meals exactly as we do today. For many people, the larger meal came later in the day. The food on the table depended enormously upon wealth. The famous image of wealthy Romans reclining while servants bring elaborate dishes is historically real, but it represents only one part of Roman society. A wealthy dinner could contain several courses: meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruit, wine, sauces, and the imported ingredients. One famous Roman condiment was garum, a fermented fish sauce that was widely used in Roman cooking. For poorer residents, meals were much simpler. Bread and grain remained important. Vegetables, legumes, olives, olive oil, cheese, and inexpensive prepared foods could form part of the diet. Many apartment dwellers had limited cooking facilities. Cooking inside Crowded buildings also increase the danger of fire. As a result, buying prepared food from shops and street vendors could be convenient. Imagine finishing your morning's work and stopping beside a small food shop. Steam rises from a container. Bread is placed beside a simple meal. People stand nearby talking. No one there thinks they are living in ancient Rome. To them, it is simply lunchtime. As the working part of the day slowed, many Romans could turn toward leisure, and few institutions were more closely associated with Roman urban life than the public baths. A Roman bath complex was much more than a place to wash. It was a social center, a place to exercise, talk, relax, meet friends, discuss business, hear gossip, and spend part of the afternoon. Admission to many public baths was inexpensive. Some were enormous. By the imperial period, monumental bath complexes could contain vast vaulted halls, pools, exercise areas, gardens, and other facilities. A visitor might begin by changing clothes. There could be exercise beforehand. Then came rooms maintained at different temperatures. The tepidarium offered warmth. The caldarium was hot. The frigidarium provided cold water. Rather than using modern soap in the way we do, bathers could apply oil to the skin and then remove oil, sweat, and dirt with a curved tool known as a strigil. Around them, conversation continued. Politics, business, rumors, sports, family matters, complaints, the ordinary subjects that people have discussed for thousands of years. For a few small coins, an ordinary Roman could enjoy facilities that require remarkable engineering. Aqueducts supplied enormous quantities of water. Furnaces heated parts of the complex. Hypocaust systems circulated hot air beneath floors and sometimes through walls. The public baths were therefore both an everyday pleasure and a demonstration of Roman engineering. If the baths were not enough, Rome offered many other forms of entertainment. There were theaters, religious festivals, celebrated celebrations. The atmosphere may have felt surprisingly familiar to anyone who has attended a major sporting event today. Could attract enormous crowds for chariot racing, another kind of different spectacle. Racing teams, gladiatorial contests, passionate supporters became one of the most famous features of Roman entertainment. Gambled, argued, but they were not everyday events for every Roman. Much ordinary leisure was far less dramatic. People met friends, played games, visited baths, walked, ate, drank, talked, and spent time with family. The Rome of everyday life was not continuously filled with gladiators and emperors. Most days were simply days. Throughout our journey, one difference has appeared again and again: wealth. There was no single experience of daily life in Rome. A senator living in a spacious house experienced the city very differently from a laborer renting a small room high inside an insula. A wealthy household might contain slaves, decorated dining rooms, gardens, private water supplies, and imported foods. A poor family might share a cramped apartment with little furniture and no running water. Even within an apartment building, wealth could be visible vertically. Better apartments were often located closer to street level. Higher floors tended to become cheaper and less comfortable. The wealthy could escape Rome during unpleasant weather and spend time at country villas. The poor remained inside the crowded city, yet both groups walked some of the same streets, used some of the same public spaces, visited baths, attended public entertainment, and watched the same sun disappear behind the city's buildings at the end of the day. As evening approached, another feature of Roman life became more noticeable: fire. Imagine thousands of people living inside crowded buildings made with timber incorporated into their structures. Now add lamps, cooking fires, braziers, workshops, and narrow streets. Fire was a serious danger. Rome suffered numerous fires throughout its history. The most famous occurred during the reign of Emperor Nero in AD 64, when a devastating fire burned large areas of the city. But smaller fires were a regular urban concern. Under Emperor Augustus, Rome developed the vigiles, an organized force that performed firefighting and night watch duties. Still, for someone living several floors above the street, the smell of smoke at night could be frightening. There were no modern smoke alarms, no emergency telephone number, no powerful fire engines arriving within minutes. A small flame could become dangerous very quickly. So as lamps were lit across Rome, the city entered a different rhythm. Night in ancient Rome was darker than anything most modern city dwellers regularly experience. There were lamps, torches, light spilling from buildings, but there were no electric street lights illuminating every road. Many people preferred to finish their activities before darkness became complete. The wealthy might attend dinners or social gatherings. Others returned to their apartments. Shops closed. Shutters came down. The city's noise changed. It did not necessarily disappear. In fact, certain forms of traffic could become more noticeable after dark. Regulations intended to reduce daytime congestion meant that carts carrying goods sometimes moved through Rome at night. Wooden wheels rolled across stone streets. Animals moved through narrow lanes. Drivers called to one another. For someone trying to sleep above the street, ancient Rome could remain surprisingly noisy. A writer living in Rome might complain about traffic below. A tired worker might simply roll over and try to ignore it. Some experiences really do survive across thousands of years. Now imagine returning to a modest Roman apartment. You climb the stairs, one flight, then another, perhaps another. The light becomes weaker as you rise. Inside the room, an oil lamp produces a small flame. Dinner is finished. The city outside is becoming dark. There's no television to turn on, no phone to check, no electric fan, no refrigerator humming in the corner. Perhaps family members talk for a while. Perhaps someone repairs clothing. Perhaps a child plays quietly. Perhaps tomorrow's work is discussed. The oil lamp must be used carefully. Fire is always a concern. Eventually, it is extinguished. The room becomes dark. Outside, Rome continues. A cart passes. Someone calls from the street. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. Footsteps disappear around a corner. And gradually, another ordinary Roman day comes to an end. When we imagine ancient Rome, it is easy to picture emperors, legions, gladiators, marble temples, and enormous monuments. Those things were real. But Rome was also a city of ordinary routines. People woke in the morning. They worried about money. They went to work. They bought food. They carried water. Children went to lessons. Friends exchanged gossip. People complained about their apartments. They visited the baths. They watched sports. They ate dinner. And eventually, they went to sleep. The buildings were different. The technology was different. The political world was different. But many of the rhythms of life would still feel strangely familiar. Perhaps that is one of the quiet pleasures of studying history. The farther we travel into the past, the more unfamiliar the world becomes. And yet, every so often, we encounter someone doing something completely ordinary, buying bread, waiting for a friend, trying to keep a child focused on a lesson, complaining about noise, enjoying a warm bath, or simply lying down after a long day. And suddenly, 2,000 years does not feel quite so distant. Thank you for joining me on another quiet journey through history. Tonight, we did not follow an emperor or conquer an empire. We simply spent an ordinary day in ancient Rome. Until our next journey, rest well, sleep peacefully, and thank you for listening to Quiet History by Song.